To a Valian, the universe is a mathematical equation. Every star burning in the dark, every species rising from the mud, every war fought across the freezing void. It is all just data. Every action has a calculated probability. Every life has a measurable, finite value. And every conflict has an inevitable, logical conclusion. Empress Silari had ruled the Valian ascendancy for 60 standard cycles using this exact calculus. Her people were cold, precise, and flawlessly beautiful. Their skin was the color of polished starlight. Their minds were crystalline structures, unclouded by the chaotic, messy interference of emotion. They did not love. They did not hate. They calculated. And right now, sitting in the freezing dark of a crippled escape shuttle, hidden deep within the jagged asteroid fields of the Obsidian Reach, Empress Silari was calculating her own death. "The usurper's fleet has cordoned off the sector," Silari said. Her voice was perfectly level. It sounded like glass sliding over ice. She didn't shiver, even though the ambient temperature in the cabin was dropping fast enough to freeze the condensation in the air. "They have deployed 3 hunter-seeker squadrons," she continued, her glowing eyes locked on a failing holographic projection. "Based on our thermal signature, the degradation of our stealth plating, and the trajectory of their patrol routes, they will find us in exactly 14 minutes. Survival probability is 0.002%. She did not look up from the table as she spoke. She didn't need to. There was only one other person on the ship. Elias Thorne did not look like a variable that could change the math. He was a human, a mercenary, hired 6 months ago during a routine diplomatic mission to the outer fringes simply because human muscle was cheap, heavily armored, and entirely disconnected from Valian politics. He was a blunt instrument, a deterrent. He sat in the co-pilot's seat, methodically cleaning the magnetic rails of a heavy plasma rifle. His armor was scarred from a dozen near misses over the past 48 hours of relentless pursuit. His face was obscured by the dim, flickering amber glow of the emergency lighting. 14 minutes is a lot of time, Your Grace, Elias said. His voice was a low, heavy rumble. To Silari's delicate, highly evolved auditory receptors, the human's voice always felt like a physical vibration, like stones grinding together deep underground. "Time is irrelevant when the outcome is mathematically fixed, Thorne," she replied. She reached out and deliberately powered down the holographic console. The blue light died, leaving only the amber emergency strobes. She folded her slender, starlit hands in her lap. She was accepting the inevitable with perfect, terrifying grace. "Your contract is hereby terminated," she said. "There is a secondary, single-occupant escape pod in the lower airlock. Its thermal shielding is intact. If you leave now, you have an 86% chance of slipping past their scanners while their sensors lock onto the mass of my vessel." Elias picked up a depleted power cell, inspected it, and tossed it to the metal deck. It clattered loudly into the silence. He pulled a fresh, fully charged cell from his tactical webbing. He slid it into the rifle. It locked in with a heavy metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap in the freezing cabin. "I'm not leaving." Silari finally turned her head. For the first time in 60 years, her perfectly composed, crystalline eyes narrowed in profound, absolute confusion. "Your statement is illogical," she stated, her tone tilting just a fraction away from perfect calm. The contract is void. The usurper has seized the ascendancy treasury. There is no financial compensation waiting for you. Staying means guaranteed termination. Fleeing means an 86% probability of life. Explain your logic. Elias stood up. He was massive compared to her. A solid, immovable wall of dense bone, scarred muscle, and blackened kinetic plating. He didn't look at her. He walked past the console, moving toward the shuttle's manual airlock release. As he walked, he unclipped a heavy bandolier of fragmentation charges from the bulkhead and slung it over his broad shoulder. "I didn't stay for the credits," Elias said. Silari stood up, her luminescent robes shifting around her. "Then why are you staying? It contradicts every biological survival instinct of a sentient species. You cannot win, Elias. There are 50 elite Praetorians sweeping this rock. Their armor is impervious to standard arms. Their reflexes are genetically enhanced. You are one human." Elias stopped at the heavy steel door of the airlock. He turned his head, looking back at her over his heavily armored shoulder. And in the dim amber light, the hardened professional mask of the mercenary finally slipped. Silari looked into his dark, tired eyes, and what she saw there defied every equation, every algorithm, and every fundamental law of the universe she had ever studied. It was not logical. It was not a calculation. It was absolute, terrifying devotion. "Because they don't know who they're hunting," Elias said softly. His voice held no fear, only a dark, quiet promise. "Lock the bulkhead behind me, Silari. Divert all remaining power to the interior blast doors, and don't open them until it's quiet." Before she could process the command, before she could form a response to the chaotic data flooding her mind, Elias slammed his fist into the manual release. The airlock hissed, the heavy doors cycled open, revealing the crushing, freezing dark of the abandoned mining colony. Without another word, the human stepped out into the void. The doors slammed shut behind him, sealing with a heavy final thud. Silari was alone. The cold logic of her mind screamed at her to run, to take the secondary pod, to secure the 86% chance of survival. She was the Empress. Her life was the only variable that mattered. Instead, she found her hands gripping the edge of the navigation console. She pressed her face against the reinforced, freezing glass of the viewport, staring out into the jagged, shadowy canyons of the asteroid. A strange, unfamiliar tightness was blooming in the center of her chest. Her breath hitched. Her perfectly regulated pulse began to race. Fear. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She was experiencing fear, but not for herself. She was terrified for him. Outside, the absolute silence of the dead asteroid was shattered. 3 Praetorian dropships descended from the starless sky like predatory birds. Their blinding white spotlight beams swept through the jagged canyons, painting the gray rock in harsh, unforgiving light. The ships hovered just above the surface, and dozens of heavily armored Valian soldiers poured out of the troop bays. They moved with perfect, terrifying synchronization. They were a hive mind of tactical efficiency, communicating silently through encrypted neural links. They fanned out, advancing on the crippled shuttle in an unbreakable formation. 50 elite killers, bred for a single purpose. They expected to breach the hull. They expected to find an Empress waiting to accept her execution with dignity. Then, the darkness bit back. A fragmentation charge detonated perfectly on the left flank. The explosion was a blinding flash of kinetic fire that instantly vaporized the rock wall, burying the lead squad under hundreds of tons of jagged stone. Before the Praetorian network could adjust its targeting algorithms, before it could even register the thermal spike of the explosive, Elias moved. He didn't fight like a Valian. He didn't fight with elegant precision or calculated mathematical strikes. He fought like a force of nature. He erupted from the shadows of a stalagmite formation, his heavy plasma rifle roaring. The superheated bolts tore through the freezing air, slamming into the pristine silver armor of the usurper's elite guard. The impact shattered their kinetic shields, throwing perfect genetically engineered soldiers backward like broken dolls. The Praetorians returned fire. Beams of concentrated energy scorched the rock around him, melting the stone into glass. But Elias didn't retreat. He didn't seek cover to calculate a new approach. When a Valian shock trooper closed the distance, lunging forward with a thermal lance, Elias didn't even raise his rifle. He dropped it. He drew a massive, serrated tungsten combat blade from his thigh sheath. The Praetorian thrust the lance. The searing heat grazed Elias's shoulder plate, melting the armor and biting deep into his flesh. It was a hit that would have instantly incapacitated any other species in the galaxy through systemic shock alone. Elias didn't even flinch. He stepped into the strike, grabbed the Valian's wrist with his left hand, and drove the serrated blade up and under the alien's rib plating with a roar that echoed through the dead canyon. Silari watched through the viewport, her hands pressed flat against the freezing glass, her crystalline mind completely paralyzed. She was witnessing an impossibility. The human was taking damage. He was bleeding. His armor was failing. By all known biological and mathematical metrics, his body should have shut down. His nervous system should have overloaded. But he was human, and Valian science had never accounted for the human spirit. They did not understand that humans did not operate on logic when something they loved was threatened. They operated on sheer, unfathomable, spiteful willpower. For 20 agonizing minutes, Elias Thorne held the choke point. He turned the narrow, freezing canyon into a meat grinder. He used the environment. He used his remaining explosives. He used the fallen bodies as cover. He fought with brutal, stubborn ferocity that completely shattered Valian tactical doctrine. The Praetorians were programmed for logical warfare. They were prepared for a strategic retreat. They were prepared for an enemy that valued its own life. They were completely unprepared for a single, bleeding human who was willing to tear the asteroid apart with his bare hands to keep them away from that shuttle door. Slowly, the firing stopped. The remaining Praetorians, their numbers decimated, their perfect formation shattered, their morale broken by the sheer, incomprehensible horror of what they were facing, did the only logical thing left. They broke formation. They retreated to their dropships, abandoning the mission, fleeing from the monster in the dark. The canyon fell silent. The only sound was the hiss of venting gas from ruined armor and the soft settling of stone dust. Inside the ship, Silari was trembling. The Empress of the Valian Ascendancy, a being of pure intellect, was shaking uncontrollably. She slammed her hand against the manual override, ignoring all security protocols, and forced the heavy airlock doors to cycle open. The freezing air rushed in, but she didn't feel it. She stepped out onto the blood-slicked stone. Elias was leaning heavily against a jagged spire of rock, about 30 yards from the ship. His armor was scorched completely black. The kinetic plating was shattered. Dark red blood, so incredibly vibrant against the grey stone, was pooling rapidly at his feet. His helmet was gone, and his head was bowed, his chest heaving with slow, wet breaths. Silari ran. Avelian Empress did not run. Avelian Ascendant did not lower themselves to touch a mercenary. But the equations were gone. The logic had burned away to ash. All that was left was the desperate, terrifying need to reach him. She slid to her knees on the sharp stone, catching his massive weight as his legs finally gave out. "Elias," she breathed. Her voice was fractured, trembling, another absolute impossibility. She pressed her glowing, starlit hands frantically against the massive breach in his chest armor, trying to stem the flow of red. His blood was startlingly, violently warm against her freezing skin. "Why?" she whispered, staring into his pale face. Tears of liquid light finally breaking and trailing down her crystalline cheeks. "The probability, the logic, you should have died. You should have left me." Elias opened his eyes. They were unfocused, heavy with pain, but as they found her glowing face in the dark, a slow, tired, lopsided smile cut through the grime and blood. He reached up. His hand was trembling, the armored gauntlet heavy and clumsy, but he moved with infinite care, gently brushing his thumb against the side of her beautiful, tear-stained face. "Told you, Your Grace," he coughed, his voice a ragged whisper. "I didn't stay for the credits." As the distant hum of the retreating dropships faded completely into the dark of the obsidian reach, Silari looked down at the broken, bleeding human in her arms. He had shattered the laws of probability. He had broken the mathematics of the universe, just to keep her safe. For the first time in 60 cycles, Empress Silari did not calculate the future. She did not calculate the odds of the usurper returning. She did not run the numbers on their survival. She just held him in the dark. And for the first time in her long, perfect life, she felt the deeply illogical, profoundly beautiful warmth of a human heartbeat against her hands. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would burn the rest of the galaxy to the ground before she ever let it stop beating.